Welcome to the Palithreads show. And today we have a very special guest, my dear sister, the most expert person on the subject we're discussing today, Ghada Sasa. Hello, Ghada.
Hello, thank you so much for having me. I'm so honored to be your first guest. So proud of you for launching this podcast.
So sweet. Thank you. It's a huge thanks to you inspiring me, pushing me to launch this project. And I appreciate that so much. And so we're going to get right into it. We're going to introduce today's subject. We're going to be talking about the ongoing fires in occupied Palestine. And my sister, Ghada, if you don't know, is currently completing her PhD, and her research focuses on Israeli green colonialism. Ghada has an incredible background. And also, just before we touch on that, I want to say this painting behind me, she painted. And she's also incredibly creative. If you see behind her, the artwork is artwork she made. She has a piano. She's an incredible piano player. And so I'm just sharing that as her brother because I know you can see a side of her that's like always activisty, very political, but she plays the oud, the different instruments and very good at debke, dancing, in addition to languages and activism. So that's just giving you more of an introduction to my incredible sister from that end. And yeah, I would love for you to introduce yourself, Rada, if you want to talk about also your academic background too, and whatever you feel like introducing on Israeli green colonialism, whatever else you feel.
Thank you, Khalid, for the best and kindest intro. I always say you inspire me so much, not just politically, but on a human level. And yeah, grateful to have you as my younger brother. And yeah, I guess to talk a bit about myself, of course, we're from the city of Ramle and the village of Madama, which is right outside of Nablus, that is currently under the Israeli occupation. And yeah, like you mentioned, I grew up really interested in the arts. I actually wanted to become a French teacher, but I found myself compelled to talk about Palestine. It was basically, I actually decided to pursue a BA in international studies and environmental studies. And then I decided to do my master's in environmental studies. And I was going to do my work on climate change and labor. And it was actually a Jewish professor, a dear friend, who encouraged me to write about Palestine. She's like, I don't see a lot of Palestinian master's students in the social sciences. Like, it was much more rare at the time. And she said, why do you give voice to your people? And of course, I heard that and just ran with it. It was like a sign for me to do something that I loved. I was always passionate about Palestine. And it was really in 2014 that with Israel's war on Gaza, that I really immersed myself in the world of activism, especially when I found out that York University, which I was attending at the time, was directly supplying Israeli weapon manufacturers. And I found myself deeply complicit in the genocide against my people. When I was doing my research, I decided to focus on Israeli greenwashing because unfortunately, as a master's student, I was exposed to a lot of that. And you know how Israel's making the desert bloom, and I knew how that propaganda was fake and it was there to conceal massive human rights violations. But what I didn't really know was Israeli green colonialism. And so this concept I used to refer to Israel's weaponization of environmental policies like tree planting and protected areas to colonize Palestine. And so I touched on that in my master's research, but that really became the focus of my doctoral project now. And I'm based at McMaster University. I'm doing my PhD in political science. So yeah, that's a bit about myself.
Thank you so much, Rada, for sharing that very impressive background history about yourself. And it's just such an honor, again, to watch you go through all of that, to learn from you, and to grow and be inspired from you along this journey. And we are so lucky to have you as anyone in the movement for justice. So I'm just going to talk about exactly what's been happening. Currently, there is the largest fire in Zionist history. It started on Wednesday, April 30, so very recently, and it grew to a massive fire very quickly along the Tel Aviv-Jerusalem highway. So the fire quickly spread to 5,000 acres of land. which, to put it in perspective for you, is approximately 6,000 football fields. People abandoned their cars. There were about 100 cars that were left abandoned. We've heard that Canada Park has been completely destroyed by the fire, with multiple roads entirely shut down. And Canada Park is a topic that we're going to touch on a bit. Ghada will touch on it more as we introduce that. Israeli Independence Day, which basically they're celebrating the Nakba, the expulsion, the genocide of Palestinians. These celebrations have been canceled as a result of these fires. 10,000 people have been evacuated. The flames have surrounded military bases. Zionists have pointed their fingers at different places. For instance, Yair Netanyahu, Benjamin Netanyahu's son, took to Twitter to accuse Palestinians of having started the fire, saying that I really hope the arson was only carried out by Arabs without any collaboration from our own people, as he also accused Israeli leftists of wanting to cancel Israeli Independence Day celebrations. So, today on this episode, we're going to ask our expert, Ghada, about Canada Park. What really caused these fires? We will discuss Israeli green colonialism and what these fires symbolize for the settler colony's future and what they mean for Palestinians. First, Ghada, what can you tell us about Canada Park? And also, if you can talk about the role of the Jewish National Fund in the colonization of Palestine with Canada Park and how this makes Canadian taxpayers complicit in the ongoing crimes of the Zionist entity. It's a lot. Sorry, but if you can touch on what you can and we can break it up and continue with it as we go.
No, it's a perfect intro. Thank you so much. And yeah, I'm actually even maybe going to talk a bit more, if it's okay, going back to the origin of Zionism, because I feel like green colonialism is a core part of Zionism that a lot of people don't know about. So basically, Zionism was founded as both a settler colonial movement and an anti Semitic movement in the 19th century in Europe. It was founded by Theodor Herzl. And yeah, it was rooted in both Jewish supremacy and white supremacy. What they basically were thinking was we want to be more like Europeans because they did face anti Semitic persecution in Europe. And so the most European thing they could do was to colonize another land. They had other ideas like converting to Christianity, but at that point, the discrimination wasn't just based on religion, right? It was really a form of racial discrimination as well. And so basically, they decided they were contemplating colonizing Argentina and Cyprus and Uganda, but they ultimately settled on Palestine. Obviously, because there was a religious connection, right? It's the Holy Land that they could make in order to justify colonizing it. But also, I want to point out that Palestinians are Semitic people, right? Historically, we've been racialized as Semites by Europeans, just like Jews. Arabs and Jews, we were called uncivilized, dirty, lazy, etc. And we were discriminated against for our racial features. And basically, what Israel did is it not only decided to colonize Palestine, but basically isolated us as the victims of anti Semitism. And it actually began to act like Nazi Germany. And so the way that we see what they're doing in Gaza, putting us into a concentration camp, the way that they're torturing us, it's all very much reminiscent of Nazi Germany. And actually, people might not know this, but when Israel colonized Palestine in 1948, they dropped leaflets over Haifa saying that we are going to do the Nakba to you, threatening them in order to get Palestinians to flee out of fear. And Nakba, they translated, and you can look at the Haganah archives. They have a translation of that document that they dropped over Palestinians, and they translated Nakba to Holocaust. So from the very beginning, they were launching a Holocaust against Palestinians.
I just want to
And
sorry,
yeah,
and just say interesting, just while we're on that note, thank you for all of that. It's like interesting because the NDP under Jagmeet, they expelled the influencer that they collaborated with because she made that comparison of what Israel's doing to Palestinians to the Holocaust. and they expelled her. So it's interesting that Israel itself has stated from the start its intention is to do a Holocaust on Palestinians. Like the word Nakba literally means that. Sorry, yeah, I just wanted to mention
Yeah,
that.
it's absolutely disgusting. No, of course, both the actions of Israel and the actions of the NDP. So, what people might not know about this settler colonial project in Palestine, settler colonialism in general is about killing all of the native population in order to take over their land. And that's basically what they did when they colonized Palestine in 1948. They ethnically cleansed 80% of Palestinians. They killed about 15,000 Palestinians. There were dozens of massacres that were carried out. And then Israel prevented Palestinians from returning to their land in violation of UN Resolution 194. And so ever since then, it's been taking more and more of our land. So in 1967, basically, in 1948, they occupied 78% of historic Palestine. And then in 1967, they occupied the remaining 22%. And ever since, they've been colonizing more of it. So basically, what's left of Palestine is a bunch of enclaves like South African Bantustans. And they're under brutal Israeli occupation, so everything is controlled. Israel has access to our labor and resources, but does not give us our rights and does not include us in its demographics so that it's considered a Jewish majority democracy, even though obviously it operates as an apartheid state. So even within what's so-called Israel, there are about 60 laws that discriminate against non-Jews. And yeah, as you can see from then, it's not only been oppressing Palestinians, mass incarcerating us, killing us at random, but also regularly launches wars, especially against the besieged city of Gaza. And as we can see now, they're starving them en masse. Since October 7, they killed possibly 500,000 Palestinians. We had a journal, an academic journal, The Lancet, say back in the summer that there's a good chance that they've killed about 200,000 Palestinians. But I imagine the number has just way surpassed that since. And so basically, a core part of this Israeli project is the Jewish National Fund. And it was founded in 1901 in order to purchase Palestinian land. And they mainly purchased land from Syrian and Lebanese landowners. But of course, most of the land that Israel gained was not purchased, it was stolen. And they actually purchased very little Palestinian land because immediately Palestinians realized this was a colonial project, that they were buying land and then not allowing Palestinians to work or live there. And that's when we saw mass Palestinian violent uprisings, because for the first time, the land was being transferred, but they were being dispossessed. And in the 30s, we saw a massive revolt. So thousands of Palestinians were killed, exiled, and this revolt was actually directed against the British. Outside of Algeria, this was the biggest indigenous revolt against occupation. And basically, the Jewish National Fund, it portrays itself as an ecological NGO. So when Israel was set up in 1948, soon after that, it actually transferred about 93% of the land to the JNF. And because the JNF is like an ecological NGO, it was able to greenwash its theft. Basically, the JNF now promotes itself for having planted about 230 million trees. It calls itself the biggest environmental group in the Middle East, and it claims to have led Israel as the only country in the world in the 21st century with a net gain of trees. And so this is all part of Brand Israel, which really kicked off in 2005. The greenwashing has been, like I said, from the founding of Israel, but in 2005, Israel really ramped up this greenwashing campaign, but it also pinkwashed itself as a gay haven. It vegan washed itself, and all of this is fake, by the way. Israel doesn't even allow gay marriage. It's not like a leading vegan nation. And even if it was, right, it's not gonna whitewash its
I
crimes.
mean, their soldiers wear
And what
vegan leather boots, so when they kill Palestinians, you know that they're wearing vegan leather boots. or when they go and kill like Palestinian cattle and assault like Palestinian agricultural land. They're wearing vegan leather boots. I
Yeah,
just
and I
had
saw in an
the
article like
insanity.
yeah, it's vegan washing is especially disgusting. And I saw it described in one article, like basically what they're doing with that is trying to argue that Palestinians, we're not even dehumanized. We're deemed as less worthy than animals. So disgusting. And yeah, this kind of pink washing, vegan washing, it's actually all rooted in Orientalism. This is how Israel's been able to get away with so much. It's because there's already these Islamophobic and anti-Arab conceptions of a deserted land that Palestinians neglected and they didn't take care of it. And they're just like sexually backward and savage. In contrast, Israel is like the superior civilized Western state that's led by white Jews, right? There's also a racial hierarchy within Israel where, of course, Ashkenazis are at the top. And that they sterilize Ethiopian women. We see their discrimination against Arab Jews. It's extremely racist. So, yeah, that's a summary. We can talk more about Israeli greenwashing. Israel claims itself to be a pioneer in drip irrigation, but that blue washes its theft of Palestinian water. It's a drying up of the Jordan River and the Dead Sea. It also, so that it's really stealing Palestinian water to irrigate all the forests that it's planting. It's not just some pioneer inventing water out of thin air.
If you can please touch on the history of the Jewish National Fund. So, what is its purpose? What it's done in Canada? It's on what you have knowledge of, and why the JNF is dangerous. What I remember is protesting outside a Jewish National Fund dinner and Stephen Harper, the Canadian Prime Minister at the time, playing music for them. And they're fundraising, like, what are they fundraising for? And so many different places in Canada, Zionist institutions will have JNF boxes. So if you can touch on like these boxes and just how Canada Park came to be. Yeah, just focusing on the Jewish National Fund. What is it basically? And yeah, also, I want to introduce, speaking of Argentina, I was just sipping some Argentinian mate, so good, with milk and honey. But
Love it.
Israel would have claimed that as being Israeli if they took Argentina. So, anyways, I'll leave Ghada to it to talk about the JNF. And thank you so much, Ghada, for your patience and sharing all
No
this wealth
worries.
of knowledge.
No, it's my pleasure. خد راحتك. Basically, the JNF greenwashed its colonization of Palestine, and actually, it set itself up as a charity in many countries, including so-called Canada. And it was only last year that, after years of campaigning by Canadians, including Nakba survivors and members of the Independent Jewish Voices of Canada, that finally the CRA agreed to revoke its charitable status. So this was a huge victory and a huge blow to the Zionist lobby.
For those who don't know,
And base
the CRA is the Canada Revenue Agency, the taxation, like government thing. Sorry.
Exactly, because we were complicit as taxpayers, and now they no longer have that charitable status. But the reason that they revoked that status is because it was found that the JNF was illegally supporting the Israeli military. And it's unfortunate that it has to come down to these like legalities as opposed to seeing, oh, JNF actually supports the ethnic cleansing of Palestine. That should be enough to have its charitable status revoked. But this ties into the fact that Canada is also a settler colony. And so it's extremely Zionist. So naturally, it's not going to recognize or condemn its ethnic cleansing operations. But of course, this was a big win, and we need to keep fighting for these changes. I want to talk about why the JNF planted all these trees. I argue that there are four main reasons why Israel planted these trees. Israel and JNF are kind of the same. The first reason they planted the trees was to stake claim to the land. Israel establishes nature reserves, which are often literally planted. Palestinians are denied the right to cultivate or to build on their land, even though Israelis all the time will be polluting and doing everything they're allowed. They're allowed, like, either soldiers will ignore them, or there have been legislation past saying, oh, Israeli settlers can actually take over this national park, but Palestinians are denied access. And then the second reason is that they prevent the return of Palestinians. Obviously, you're setting up these trees. You can no longer physically access your home unless you cut it down. But then they've set up these environmental authorities like the Green Patrol, which are extremely violent, that shoot at Palestinians or incarcerate, injure them if they try to access their land. There've also been the installation of fences, entrance fees. Oftentimes they're charging Palestinians way more than Jewish people just to access these parks. And it's interesting to note that just 2 years after Israel occupied West Bank and Gaza in 1967, they actually afforested the Green Line. So they materialized the Green Line, which refers to the separation between the West Bank and the rest of historic Palestine. And so they actually prevented Palestinians that way from returning to what's now called Israel.
So basically, you're
And
saying, just to clarify, that Israel used plants, the environment, as a colonial tool, like to set up a border. They used the planting of strategically planted trees in locations and forests in a way to prevent Palestinians from being able to return to their land and to reshape the maps in violations of international law.
exactly.
Okay.
Well said. Because, of course, a lot of Palestinians were expelled from Israel. They ended up in refugee camps in the West Bank and Gaza. And yeah, they afforested this separation. And also, the planting of these trees made it easier for Israel to surveil Palestinians. Just to give you some statistics, about 44% of the 418 Palestinian villages that were ethnically cleansed by Israel have been basically transformed into these nature reserves and national parks, which I refer to as green colonies. And then 24% of what's now called Israel is also consisting of green colonies. Now, you might ask, like, what happened to the other 3/4 of what's now called Israel? Actually, about 25% is military reserves, and about 30% is empty land. And this is just remarkable because a lot of times Israelis say, oh, Palestinians can't return, or if they have to return, where will we go? But Dr. Salman Abu Sitta, a famous Palestinian scholar, has explained actually like 88% of the land is actually empty. It's either occupied by these trees, which are invasive that we'll get to in a second, or military zones. And yeah, so it's actually physically very easy for Palestinians to return. The only thing stopping them is Israeli Jewish supremacy, white supremacy. My third point, which is that these parks are aiming to dehistoricize, Judaize, and Europeanize Palestine. So Israel infamously plants these trees under the guise of making the desert bloom. There's a quote from the Jewish National Fund that's still there on their website, and I'm going to read it now. It says, "The first Jewish pioneers who came to the land of Israel towards the end of the 20th century found a desolate land that provided no shade whatsoever." This is such a bold lie, especially the fact that you can still find olive trees that are hundreds of years old that show that Palestinians were heavily cultivating their land. In fact, there
Thousands.
was an article, thousands, and there's an article from 1979 that showed that even up to that date, Israel couldn't cultivate the land as much as Palestinians were. And this idea that Palestine was empty is obviously false. Palestinians had thriving cities and villages, schools, churches, cafes. It's considered one of the cradles of civilization, and it's considered part of the Fertile Crescent. So one of the first agricultural societies in the world emerged in Palestine. So it's just incredible that they try to erase that history, but also co-opt it by saying, like, we made the desert bloom.
Also
But
going
that's
back,
what
this goes back to it's I don't know why it seems the NDP politicians be having all the best quotes, but the NDP education minister Selena Robinson, who said that Palestine was like a crappy piece of land, like we were stupid and nothing was there. Apparently it was just trash, and Zionists came from Europe, these incredible white people who can come and teach the savage Arabs who are clueless somehow they were living on this crappy piece of land, sustaining themselves for thousands of years, and they produced all this food, which is just simply incorrect. Like, going back to what you were saying, the oldest olive tree in the world is in Palestine. It's near Bethlehem, and it's almost 5,000 years old. And in also like some of the research like I did, in which we know like Israelis, when they first came, they didn't know how to sustain themselves from the land, how to properly plant and, yeah, produce food for themselves and to use the food in cuisine. So then they start co-opting and stealing a lot of Palestinian dishes. One, because they want to create like this sense that this culture is theirs, and two, because they, yeah, want to learn to live and eat from the food sustained from that land. Sorry, but that was just thoughts that came to my mind as you were speaking and thought to get them out.
No, your interjections are helping this conversation, so thank you. I think, yeah, exactly. Like, it's so ironic because on the one hand, they want to destroy our culture, but on the other hand, they're trying to co opt it. And that's because, yeah, they're claiming to be from that region and then they want to completely erase our memory. And basically, this idea that, oh, indigenous people did not take care of the land, it's not unique to Palestine. This goes back centuries, and we can talk about being based in Canada. The same thing has happened to indigenous people. And this is actually something I wanted to talk about, which is that green colonialism, I argue, is rooted in not only Zionism, but Western environmentalism. And so this was a movement that emerged in the 18th century. And it's based on the separation of human and environmental rights, saying that basically all humans need to be excluded from the nature to protect it, which is crazy, right? We cannot be separated. We are part of nature. And we understood that globally for millennia. But what Western environmentalism is trying to do, I argue, is to basically demonize people of color, particularly indigenous people. And by demonizing them, they were able to justify their expulsion from lands and then to claim it. And so national parks and nature reserves were actually invented by the United States, like this idea of protected areas as a colonial one. And most protected areas in the world were established through kicking out the indigenous inhabitants. And so we saw a lot of indigenous people, like they were mocked for being hunters and gatherers. And they would say, oh, they didn't cultivate the land. And so they were savages. And so now we can cultivate it. Right. And so this is why Israel, a lot of times, it's cultivating the land to say the land is ours. At the same time, they're deforesting the native flora, like the olive trees, the citrus trees, to deny our history. And obviously, even if we didn't cultivate the land, and even if Palestine was completely desert, that doesn't excuse colonialism, right? But it's just not true. They're just erasing our history. And yeah, it's really messed up. And I can talk about this later, like this kind of ecocentrism and the racism of the Western environmental movement that's allowed Israel and other countries to get away with so much. But just to go back to this point of dehistoricizing the land, I want to mention that a lot of times in these parks, the Jewish and European histories are spotlighted, but the villages are completely ignored. And so are the inhabitants. Maybe they'll mention buildings like schools, but Arabic is absent from many signs and most brochures. And a lot of times, bustans, like home-centered orchards that Palestinians built, they're co-opted as Israeli creations, or they're shown as like a miracle in nature. And then the last point I argue is just Israel plants these parks just to improve its image on a worldwide scale, which we've already discussed. But yeah, it's really insidious. That's basically the role of the Jewish National Fund. It's there just to take our land. And of course, when it builds these pines and these, as it deforests the land, what it's doing is denying Palestinian livelihoods. A lot of Palestinians until now, especially in the West Bank and Gaza, they rely on agriculture. So when they're building these nature reserves and saying Palestinians can no longer cultivate, we are deprived of that right to nourish our bodies and then make a decent livelihood. So it all comes back to genocide and white supremacy.
Thank you for giving that background. I think it helps us have a much better idea the Jewish National Fund, but also like even just globally, the quote unquote environmental movement and national parks hopefully gives people some more food for thought when they go to national parks in the Western world.
Yeah, like these you're welcome.
Yeah.
These areas sorry, maybe like people just remember when they go to these areas, right? You make it seem like, oh, this was like uninhabited. This is like virgin forest. It's very gross. And it's no, people live there. Like people shape these they're stunning because of how indigenous people are able to take care of them. And it's interesting that only recently, like countries have been realizing, like we messed up by kicking out indigenous people and demonizing their practices. Like now, a lot of national parks are actually doing slash and burn, just like indigenous people did, being like, actually, that helps to like nourish the land. And we've seen more recently, Australia, even Canada now is recognizing tribal parks, basically that secure indigenous rights. And sure enough, they're realizing this has actually improved ecosystems because, as I argue, the problem behind climate change is not indigenous people. It's capitalism, white supremacy, and misogyny, which all three are deeply interlinked. That should be our focus. And so that's the issue when environmental rights movement completely ignores human rights. It's laughable.
No, how can you have, like we just had Canadian elections, how can you be caring about the environment when every party is calling for more military spending? The NDP, for instance, being pro-NATO and tying it back to the Israeli settler colony or wherever else, like just bombing Gaza and it's like a military state, or the US. Like, how can you ever take the environment seriously when the military is the main like environmental destroyer, right? And you're not only killing people, you're destroying the environment, killing animals, killing the like you're killing everything with the military. And yeah, anyways, that was just yeah.
If I can bounce off of that,
Of course.
militarism is a huge contributor to climate change that's not talked about in the environmental movement. And Israel is a huge military state. I think it was Dr. Samana Basita who said Israel is basically a military reserve with people living in it. About a third of it has been converted into a third of the land Israel occupies has been converted into firing zones. And if you include the West Bank and Golan Heights, Israel militarized three quarters of the land that it's annexing. Proportional to its size, it's the most extensive militarized control of land in the world. And also, if the US military was a state, it would be the 47th biggest greenhouse gas emission producer, ahead of Sweden and Denmark. And the war industry is producing at least 10% of carbon emissions globally. And this is probably a huge underestimate because a lot of countries don't disclose fully or even partially their emissions. Like they don't need to. They've had that exemption under Kyoto, etc., because of the lobbying of states and corporations. The military is also the biggest consumer of oil in the world. So this is just to shed some light on how militarism is so deeply anti-environment, which should be obvious. Even in the Rio Declaration passed by the UN in 1992, the Principle 24 said warfare is inherently destructive of sustainable development. So the idea that Israel is making itself as an environmental leader, and that claim is accepted by the environmental community, is absurd. About both men, Israeli men and women, are recruited into the army, and the military pervades every aspect of their lives.
Thank you, first of all, for sharing those statistics and just all of that knowledge. And you're exactly right. It's a joke when you pretend to care about the environment and to push for fighting climate change while supporting militarism. It's utter hypocrisy. And so, inshallah, we continue to fight against that and to call for demilitarization. You cannot be progressive and you cannot be serious in the fight for climate change if you don't advocate for demilitarization globally. And so now just to go back to the subject, as the fires push strong in historic Palestine, we mentioned Canada Park. We talked about the Jewish National Fund. Is it possible if you can talk a little more based on your knowledge about Canada Park how it was exactly created, the villages that were erased, how that happened, the process. And also, you're more than welcome. Feel free if you want to mention your research. Why is there a park called Canada Park? And if there is, I know you have a publication that was made recently and it talks about USA Independence Park. So you can talk about that if you want. Yeah. And feel free to, if you want to mention, we heard talk of the Aleppo pines, and is that Syrian? Is that European? What exactly? There is a lot of talk about this. So I'll leave that there to you.
Yeah, thank you. I feel like I actually skimmed over it. I feel like sometimes I do that as a Palestinian and someone who's been researching this topic for a while, so forgive me. But as I mentioned before, like about half of the Palestinian villages that were ethnically cleansed, at least 418 of them, I know that there's been more, they've been converted into green colonies. And what that means is Israel literally planted on top of destroyed and depopulated Palestinian villages in order to hide their memory and the war crimes that they committed. And yeah, so they planted on top of them, often even on top of deforested olives. And about 88% of the trees that Israel's planted, right, those 240 million trees JNF boasts about, are actually not indigenous to the land. So a lot of these trees are Australian eucalyptus trees, for example, but also Aleppo pine. And so I've seen some Zionists the last couple of days, because obviously people are talking about how the invasive trees contributed to the latest fire. And so Zionists are saying, oh, wait, but it's called Aleppo pine. So obviously it's native to the area and you're all wrong. But that's actually not true. If you look into the name, it was mistakenly named by a European scientist. And the Aleppo pine is not native to Syria. So Aleppo, of course, is a huge Syrian city. It's actually native to Morocco, Algeria, and then mostly it's found in Spain and then the south of France and Italy. So this was introduced to Syria and it was introduced to Palestine in the 1920s by the British. And then Israelis began planting it en masse. And so in the 80s, it was found that this pine constituted, it made up 50% of Israeli plantations. And really, it became to symbolize Israel. And the reason Israel chose this plant was that the pine tree grows fast. It doesn't need much care. And it also dies quickly, but they don't really like to think long term. And basically, yeah, it burns up like crazy. So what I say is they basically converted the country into a tinderbox. And so you throw a cigarette and the whole area is on fire. They also need a lot of water. They're easily killed by pests. So yeah, they planted this monocultures of these pines, which have drop needles that acidify the land, make it difficult for other plants to grow. The Naqab, so the northern half of Palestine is Mediterranean. The southern half is a Naqab, which is considered a desert. But even then, the northern half, Bedouin Palestinians have been cultivating it richly. It was known as Palestine's breadbasket. And the southern half is minerally abundant. But what Israelis did by planting trees there, these pines, is that they sucked up all the available water. And they've contributed to desertification and actually warming the climate there. By the way, Israel ethnically cleansed about 90% of Bedouin Palestinians. And it really directs its greenwashing propaganda against them. Basically, that's a bit about these pine trees. And following the wildfires, Israel immediately jumped to say Palestinians caused it. They don't care about the land. We do. Literally, Netanyahu was making these arguments. And then it turned out that basically it seems like Israeli hikers launched the fire by accident. And this is actually what I thought all along. I didn't think it was Palestinians, or I didn't think it was like, I don't know, some kind of resistance action. I thought this was probably negligence because we've seen this happen in addition to climate change. Because in 2010, there was a forest fire, also a human accident that was called terrorist at first, and that killed 44 Israelis in 2016. We've seen negligence also spark fire across 2021. There was massive fires around Jerusalem. And then last year, when Hezbollah launched rockets against the north, it actually lit up much of Beria forest, which is a forest Israel planted over 6 Palestinian villages that it ethnically cleansed and massacred. And Beria forest is its largest planted forest. So it's so clear that these pine trees are contributing to these forest fires. And Israel has realized this mistake over the last couple of years. And that's why it itself has been, ironically, uprooting these pine trees. And then by doing that, they're revealing the Palestinian ruins that they've inadvertently protected. And so what I argue, and a lot of people are saying now, is that the land itself is resisting. Like, even after decades that Israel has been planting these trees, they're still going up in flames. And I always talk about this one village, Mushaydid, where the ethnically cleansed inhabitants came back to see it after decades where the pines kept dying and she didn't have to replant them, that some of them split in half and olive trees grew in the middle. And so that speaks to the steadfastness of olive trees as a symbol of Palestine, like just how strong they are. And yeah, I guess that touches on like the forest fires and how they're fueled by this pine. And by the way, Israelis started calling it Jerusalem pine, which is outrageous because of how many they planted around Jerusalem. And that's even more confusing for people. But like I said, it's not indigenous to the land. And in my research, I show that when Israel planted nature reserves and national parks, it actually concentrated them in Jerusalem because it wants to claim the city as its undivided capital. And of course, a part of Jerusalem is recognized as Palestinian under international law. But yeah, it doesn't care. It obviously wants all of the land and beyond. We see now how it's attacking Syria and Lebanon to create this greater Israel. I also say that they're concentrated in the north, where most Palestinians will survive the Nakba remain, and then the West Bank, which it is actively annexing, and then An-Naqab, which, yeah, as I said, they're targeting the rest of the Bedouin Palestinian population there. Now, where Israelis are mostly concentrated, Jewish people, especially in the Tel Aviv and central districts, you'll find that there's hardly any green colonies. So they're really trying to use these reserves to take more land. I don't know if you have a comment. I know I'm talking a lot, but I do want to talk about Canada Park.
No, I love hearing everything that you're sharing. So thank you so much. I just have, one comment to add about the Aleppo pines is that it's interesting that it was a European that named it that because clearly it is not indigenous to Syria because we've seen also increasing fires of these pines in Syria over the past years. And last year there was a massive fire that broke out in Latakia around Kasab region and Homs in Syria. People had to flee and it was really devastating. So yeah, and just the point that you mentioned of like the olive tree growing between these invasive trees that the Zionist regime is like planting, and also adding about the significance of like olive trees and the war that Israel has had on indigenous like Palestinian trees. For instance, Israel has uprooted about 800,000 Palestinian olive trees since 1967 in our own village in Madama in the occupied West Bank. Even when we're there, we're always seeing Israeli settlers coming down and burning these Palestinian olive trees. But it's astonishing how, despite their efforts to erase these indigenous trees, to build, to bring these European trees keep burning on fire, and the indigenous trees that Palestinians indigenous to the land have lived and sustained off of for hundreds and thousands of years, they keep pushing back. And it's just like, speaking of the symbolism, we'll get back to Canada Park, but it like foreshadows to, in the end, what happens in the future. And it gives you optimism. It's like they can try what they want, even with Gaza. But the fact that like Palestinians in Gaza are still living there, it's like a testament that like to the resilience of the indigenous peoples and inhabitants of the land, and that nothing they do can erase us because they've literally bombed everything, bombed like almost everyone. We mentioned astronomical numbers of people killed. Like we don't even can't even imagine it. The healthcare, I cannot imagine life there. But the fact Palestinians are still there, they are still resisting. It's really, for me, beautiful that and telling how just like the olive tree comes back and snaps in the middle between these invasive species, like the Palestinians are not going anywhere. And any efforts to try to erase us will fail. Sorry, that was a long comment to add. I will hand over back to you to if you want to elaborate and add and talk about Canada Park. Thank you.
No, I think this was so good. Thank you. Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned the like the way that indigenous trees are so resilient. Actually, I was talking to Palestinian agriculturists explaining how they have photos of how like the Israeli pines are on fire while the indigenous flora is intact. And it's funny because Zionists were trying to say this week, oh, it's so like suspect how Palestinian trees are okay or like their areas are okay. But it's no, that makes sense why the indigenous flora is able to withstand climate change and these fires better than the invasive trees. I guess I wanted to talk about Canada Park. I'm trying to think if I missed something because you were mentioning a lot of good points, but I guess I'll move on to Canada Park. I'll come back to see if I forgot anything. But yeah, I wanted to actually talk about this one article by Ismail Zayed, who's actually from one of the villages that was ethnically cleansed and colonized by this park. So Canada Park was built over Beit Nuba, Imwas, and Yalu, which were occupied by Israel in 1967 and shortly after razed to the ground. So he actually cited an Israeli journalist and reserve soldier who was occupying his village of Beit Nuba. And here's what it said. The unit commander told us that it was decided to blow up 3 villages in our sector. They were Beit Nuba, Imwas, and Yalu. We were told to block the entrances of the villages and prevent inhabitants from returning. The order was to shoot over their heads and tell them not to enter the village. Beit Nuba is built of fine quarry stones. Some of the houses are magnificent. Every house is surrounded by an orchard, olive trees, apricots, vines, and presses. They were well kept. Among the trees, there were carefully tended vegetable beds. At noon, the first bulldozer arrived and pulled down the first house at the edge of the village. Within 10 minutes, the house was turned into rubble. The olive trees and cypresses were all uprooted. After the destruction of 3 houses, the first refugee column arrived from the direction of Ramallah. There were old people who could hardly walk, murmuring old women, mothers carrying babies, small children. The children wept and asked for water. They all carried white flags. We told them to go to Beit Sira. They told us they had been driven out. They had been wandering like this for 4 days, without food, some dying on the road. They asked to return to their village. Some had a goat, a lamb, a donkey, or a camel. A father ground wheat by hand to feed his 4 children. The children cried. We went to fetch the Arabs some water. We stopped a car with Major, and we asked the officers why these refugees were sent from one place to another and driven out of everywhere. They told us, what do we care about the Arabs anyway? We drove them out. They go on wandering like lost cattle. The weak die. Our unit was outraged. I just want to pause here for a sec and explain a lot of times soldiers try to like humanize themselves and try to show that they cared and they were upset. And I don't really care for their tears, but anyways, I'm just going to finish this short account. The refugees gnashed their teeth when they saw the bulldozers pull down the trees. None of us understood how Jews could behave like this. No one understood why these Fallahin villagers shouldn't be allowed to take blankets and some food. The chicken and doves were buried in the rubble. The fields were turned into wasteland in front of our eyes. The children who went crying on the road will be Fidaiyin, freedom fighters in 19 years in the next round. Thus, we have lost the victory. And it was in 1973 that Bernard Bloomfield of Montreal decided to establish Canada Park. And so by establishing pines over the whole area, they tried to completely erase their memory. And now, so Israelis could go and have picnics over Palestinian graves, like over the villages where they lived and achieved. Hamas was like, historically, Christians believe that's where Jesus first appeared after his crucifixion. These are rich histories that Israel has tried to wipe out and convert into entertainment sites. And then now about 70% of it has gone up in flames. And I guess that's just one example of so many parks. And like you mentioned, I researched USA Independence Park, which Israel established over 8 ethnically cleansed villages. Also in the Jerusalem area, they also established apartheid South Africa forest. They have, I think, one named after Germany. They have British forest. So of course they're naming their parks after settler colonies and other white supremacist regimes that have supported them and show that they're civilized and different than the rest of the Arab world. So yeah, I guess that's the story behind Canada Park. It is absolutely shameful that Canada allowed, the ethnic cleansing of this area, which saw Israel literally destroy homes on top of disabled and elderly Palestinians who couldn't leave, and just saw the ethnic cleansing of about 10,000 Palestinians from these 3 villages. And yeah.
Wow, thank you for that. First of all, just horrific. And the fact that account isn't even from a Palestinian, from a Zionist soldier. And I love that. Yeah, it's unfortunate that maybe that gives more legitimacy to the story. And it tells you how much worse the situation probably was if this is a Zionist soldier that's like recounting this. And yeah, I love that you mentioned. It's like basically imagine a Nazi soldier being like, oh, it was like so bad. It's like you were literally a member of that force. So you were a part of that. And yeah, so
Yeah.
thank you for
It's
that.
called like shoot and cry. Apparently, this is the Israeli ethos of shoot and cry, according to Ilan Pape.
Wow. Yeah, now I guess you've
Yeah.
cleansed yourself of the guilt. Ugh. And I was gonna add actually about Canada Park. It's interesting. There's a CBC documentary that was made covering it from I think the 70s or 80s. They go there and there's a huge Canadian flag there and it was a key park for them and a symbol for the Zionist entity. And now this week it's completely destroyed from the fires. I don't know if you want to touch on just the significance of that basically the park was built in the 70s and 50 years later it's gone. And it wasn't like Palestinians that even did it. It's like basically they decided to plant like they killed the original inhabitants of that land. They expelled them from their lands. Some of them they demolished the homes over them because they were disabled or elderly. And then they go and bring in European plants that are clearly not meant to be there. And then the park burns. So what is a lesson, or do you think the Zionist entity can possibly would ever learn from this? Or also, what does this mean for Palestinians? Or if you want to just touch on that, I guess briefly, and then yeah, I guess that's it for this for Canada Park.
Yeah, for sure. Basically, yeah, I don't think they're gonna learn from this. Like this debate over the pine tree has been going on for the last 2 decades. Because, like I said, there's been other fires that have been linked to these pines. And then in 2019, actually, the head of the JNF's forest department, Khalil Adara, he wrote in 20 or Adar wrote in 2019 that the pines will, and I quote, will continue to be the backbone of forestation efforts in Israel.
So they're digging
So
in.
yeah, they're digging in. I think there's so much colonial arrogance that they don't really think about the long term. And for me, it is hugely symbolic. Yesterday, I learned from Jonathan Cook. I was listening to him, and he was saying how Israel maybe doesn't care that these pine trees don't last long or that they're thinning them out now because they don't need to hide their war crimes anymore. Like it's being live streamed, this Holocaust against Gaza right now. And I think that they're obviously scared. The Israeli president came out after these forest fires and said that we need to do more to tackle climate change. But like I said, like this is just hilarious. You're not tackling climate change with what you're doing. Just within the first 2 months of the genocide, Israel reportedly released more greenhouse gas emissions than 20 climate vulnerable countries. And that's a huge underestimate according to The Guardian. Like we cannot understand how much devastation like they It's completely deforested. The bombings, there's so many statistics about it, but Israel's been even testing new weapons in Gaza. Like, Palestinians have been reporting this, and it's known that for decades, Israel has been using Palestinians as a testing laboratory. That's how it's become one of the biggest arms exporters. So we don't know what, like, and how long it'll take the earth to recover. Now, I do think that, personally, that Palestine is going to be free by 2030. And I've been saying that for a while because we were visited at York University by Jamal Jum'a, who is one of the leading organizers for BDS. And he was explaining to us how it took 31 years for the apartheid South African regime to dismantle with the help of their boycott movement. And so, because Palestine launched its boycott movement in 2005 against Israel, he was expecting it's going to take about the same amount of time for Palestinians to also dismantle apartheid here back home. But basically, if you look at this map it was this visual produced by Visualizing Palestine, it shows how, in many ways, the Palestinian boycott movement has been accelerating even faster than the South African one, which would make sense, hopefully, because they set the precedent, right? South Africa, of course, still one of our biggest supporters today. But yeah, basically, because of these historical factors, I always thought that 2030 is when it's going to be free. And it's hard to believe that now because, like, of what they're doing to Palestinians. It is so horrific, and I feel so ashamed and helpless sometimes when I look at what's going on, that we're not doing more. But at the same time, remind myself that we're still boycotting, we're still targeting arms manufacturers. Israel's being prosecuted, and same with Netanyahu on in international courts. So it has lost a lot of its legitimacy. And then we see these fires, and yeah, it just reminds us that liberation is on the horizon. And 6 months before apartheid South Africa fell, nobody could believe it was going to happen. But when things change, they change fast. Settler colonialism, unfortunately, even by scholars, even by people who oppose it, a lot of times it's made out to be permanent, right? Because you look at Turtle Island, you say, oh, it's been colonized for centuries, and still people here, the indigenous people, are struggling for liberation. But I truly believe that we live in a special era where we are going to see the decolonization of both Palestine, Turtle Island, and other areas. And it's the same for climate change, because scientists are warning us if we don't act immediately, we honestly are risking huge humanitarian disasters. So we need to act quickly. Like I said, we need to start by dismantling all systems of oppression. And if you care about climate change, give land back to the indigenous people. Not because we're somehow more environmentally friendly than others, because then there's the whole like racist trope of the ecological savage of, oh, we're like so similar to nature, and sometimes it can get weird. But
Like indigenous people are animals.
yeah, basically, but land back because that's the right thing to do. But also, indigenous people know best how to take care of their land. And I believe it's 80% of the world's biodiversity right now is actually protected by indigenous peoples. So
And also,
it's
you
sad,
cannot, how do you care about the environment if you don't care about people? Like, it goes hand in hand. You have good ethics and principles and values. You can't be good to people also if you don't care. Like, someone who's terrible to pets is probably also terrible to people. Someone who's violent towards like nature, like even for us as Muslims, our Islamic values and following like teachings of the Prophet, peace be upon him, it's like being good like people, but also to other living beings and creatures, and that includes even plants. Sorry, I just wanted to add, just things go hand in hand, and as you say, like the separation can't be made. You cannot care for the environment if you're still colonizing a people and not giving people back their land, whether they are better, quote unquote, for the environment or not. That's not your say. I don't get to go to someone's house and kitchen and be like, they're not very clean. I'm cleaner. So I'm going to take over their house and have a nicer kitchen than what they would have managed. That's insane. And even if that's the case, that's not up to you to just do. Sorry, yeah.
No, of course. Yeah, I agree. And same thing for me. You can't pretend to care about Palestinians and then ignore Black people and their struggle for liberation. Or, of course, there's also a lot of Afro-Palestinians. You can't ignore gay and trans people and their struggle for liberation. Like, all of these issues are interconnected. And by helping liberate one group, you're helping everybody else. And yeah, for me, this kind of binary thinking is really outdated. We really need to challenge it. Yes, there are separations between humans and non-humans, but there's so much more that unites us. And this is why, for me, I draw on Palestinian traditions and Islam to highlight an alternative environmentalism that is actually intersectional and holistic. I talk about, for example, the concept of fauna in Palestine, that emphasizing how when we take care of the land, takes care of us. So it's really, this relationship to the land is rooted in love and respect. And even the concept of Tawheed in Islam that emphasizes how we're all belonging to the same God. And so we need to be caring for each other. And yeah, so we need to look at decolonizing environmentalism and abolishing these binaries. That's really the only way forward in all of this. Yeah, it's really shameful and not surprising for me that the environmental movement has been so quiet about Palestine. Because when I started my research like several years ago, I realized that basically even the most radical environmental big groups like Greenpeace, they were hardly talking about human rights. In the last couple of years, we've seen that a little bit change. Like, they'll talk about like anti-Asian racism, anti-Black racism, but it's still, when it comes to Palestine, it's been very quiet. Only very recently I've seen Greenpeace start to talk about the ethnic cleansing of Palestinians, but it's still very shameful. And I guess this is why I was interested in this topic. In one way, I wanted to expose the violations of Palestinian rights that are greenwash and challenge this racist paradigm of Western environmentalism, but also I wanted to bring back Palestinian memory. And so that's why for USA Independence Park, I looked at a lot of oral interviews with Nakba survivors to remind people of, yeah, not just what Israelis did to them, but also their beautiful memories, like how the plants that they grew, their weddings, their amazing accomplishments, etc.
Thank you so much for sharing that. And yeah, I guess briefly, I just wanted to add a few numbers so that I found. Israelis have uprooted more than 3 million trees since the year 2000, not so long ago. And according to the Arab Group for Protection of Nature, destroying trees, as Ghada you said, is a way of erasing the history and existence of Palestinians. And according to a graphic from Visualizing Palestine, the burning and destruction of 800,000 Palestinian olive trees since 1967 is the equivalent of raising all 24,000 trees in New York's Central Park 33 times. So imagine destroying 33 Central Parks. That is what Israel, which tries to portray itself as an environmental steward and exports its technology to countries such as fascist Modi India, which claims it's buying great Israeli environmental technology to build its own, advance its agriculture. Point is, we are clearly seeing that just as Palestinians resist, the land also resists, and the land resists Zionist occupation. And that's pretty much everything. Are there any other points, Lada, that you would like to add onto the subject?
I don't think I have anything else. I think we touched on everything. The issue with the environmental movement is not just about green colonialism. There's ecofascism. We've seen people celebrate COVID in the sense that, oh, it's killing people. Of course, that's usually referring to people of color. We've seen this like neo-Malthusianism that's saying basically we need to look at the global south and target women of color for having so many babies. So we've seen it take some really disgusting forms of racism. And this is why we need to make sure that at the heart of environmentalism is human rights. And yeah, I just wish that people would stand in solidarity with Indigenous people, including our resistance, recognize that Palestinians, throughout all this time, they're resisting by not only staying on their land, but armed resistance, cultural resistance. In this case of green colonialism, we've developed like the iNakba app that allows us to like track hundreds of Palestinian villages, and it's interactive. So you can also upload information. We have Palestine Remembered as an online archive. We offer tours. Same, there's this Israeli organization called Zokrot, which means memory. And they provide tours of a lot of these parks to show people the history behind these areas. So there's a lot of forms. There are a lot of ways that people can resist. And I encourage anybody watching to do what they can to also resist. Of course, support Palestinian fundraisers in Gaza when you can. Keep sharing information about what's going on and try to spotlight the voices of those being oppressed, like Palestinians when it comes to Palestine. Yeah, that's all I guess I have for today, but thank you so much. This was such a great conversation and always a pleasure talking.
Thank you so much, Ghada. First, I want to say it's been such an honor, privilege to have you on this show, not just as my sister, but as a global expert on this topic. I am so honored. And also, if you don't already, what are you doing? Follow Ghada on Twitter, Instagram, go read her published papers. Ghada, where can they find your published papers? And you can say what they are. For instance, you have the one on oppressive pines and American Independence Park.
Yeah, thank you so much. Yeah, I have one on it's called Oppressive Pines, and this one is free access. I have also another one, it's on American Independence Park, and you can find all my publications on my academia page. So I can send you the link for that.
I'll
But
have it.
yeah,
I'll
you
make
can
sure that's
easily Google it.
shared, the academia page for Ghada when we post this.
Sounds good.
Okay, thank you so much. Any other places you suggest for people who are interested to get like information about Israeli green colonialism, or like you mentioned Zokrot, I guess
Mm,
that's an excellent source.
yeah. I'm trying to think who else is doing work. I know like Zatoun like supports Palestinian olive farmers. You can check out, I saw yesterday a great post from Olive Odyssey on Instagram. Um, yeah, unfortunately, there's not too many people, I guess, focused on this, but these are like the main people working, I guess, on this issue. And yeah, I think spotlighting Palestinian voices in general is really helpful. Yeah.
Thank you so much for giving us your time and wealth of knowledge. And yeah, thank you for coming on the Palithreads show. Love you
Thank
so
you,
much,
Habibi.
sister.
My pleasure. And thank you for everybody listening.
And
Love
thank
you
you
too.
to everyone listening and the support. And please let me know if you have any feedback, critique, and we'll be in touch. And there will be more content soon. Please share, subscribe, support. Bye. Salam.
We're so.
I can't do this with other guests. Also had the whole Godiva dark chocolate while we're talking. How about it?
Did you just eat this on camera?
Yes. I'm telling you, like, shame. Alhamdulillah, I like shoved it in my mouth quick.